Hello and welcome to this lecture on immigration and the immigrant experience. In this lecture, we are going to overview immigration in the United States from 1865 to about 1900. A couple caveats. This is a general introduction to immigration and immigrant patterns and the reception of immigrants during the period 1865 to 1900. In subsequent lectures, we will dig into more detail about this. In a subsequent lecture, we will talk more about working in factories and in mines and in these industrial industries in which immigrants came to work. So we'll dig deeper into what it was like for immigrants as well as non-immigrants to work in these industries during the period 1865 to 1900 in a subsequent lecture. The second caveat is, in this lecture, I will mention immigrants from China, so the Chinese immigrants and the Chinese immigrant experience, but I will do so only in a general sense. In the next lecture, I will dig deeper into the Chinese immigrant experience with much more depth to explore that particular immigrant experience, because that particular immigrant experience is significant in a lot of ways for understanding America and for understanding identity constructs and the way in which immigrants were received in the United States. So that immigrant experience requires a much more detailed lecture. So the Chinese immigrants will be mentioned in this lecture, but we will get a much more detailed lecture on them in a subsequent lecture. So let's talk about immigration and its relationship to industrialization. Industrialization requires a workforce. Industrialization requires raw materials, markets, and above all, a workforce. Industrialization changes the nature of work. It turns work from skilled to unskilled labor. Industrialization creates a different type of work experience that we'll explore in subsequent lectures, but above all, in a basic sense, industrialization requires a workforce. So as the United States began to undergo industrialization between 1840 to 1860, it began to require workers. Now, initially, industries solved this problem by placing their factories in cities to take advantage of where there were populations. But pretty soon, the cities did not have enough working age people to satisfy their demands. And so what you see happening pretty quickly is what scholars call a rural to urban immigration pattern, in which people are leaving the countryside and going to the cities, thus causing urbanization in the cities to grow to feed the labor demands of the factories in the city. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why do people in rural areas end up moving to cities? Because industrialization puts small businesses and crafts that had thrived in rural America essentially out of business. There are no longer the same need for tailors and seamstresses and blacksmiths and shoemakers and all of the crafts that were a part of a thriving rural community in pre-industrial America. Those businesses have been driven out by the factories. You no longer are going to pay a tailor who has expertise, but must charge for that expertise and their labor the amount of money that you would pay for your clothing when you can buy it from the general store, mass-produced by a factory in Boston or New York or Philadelphia or somewhere else. You're not going to pay a blacksmith to make tools when you can get metal tools from a mass-produced factory at the general store. And so what happens is that industrialization puts those businesses in rural America out of business, and those people need work, so they flock to city to work in the factories. Now, the work in the factories is usually for very low pay. We'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. And the work conditions are dangerous and grueling, but it is work. But even the rural to urban migration didn't satisfy the labor demand of these growing industries. And so we had immigration. We talked about that in our foundations lectures, how you had immigration from Ireland and the German lands. But what happens after the Civil War between 1865 and 1920 is immigration just exponentially explodes in America. Between 1865 and 1920, 28 million immigrants arrived into the United States. 28 million. That is a tremendous amount of immigration, the biggest period of immigration in American history. You have to understand is these immigrants are all, not all of them, but the vast majority of them are going to get married and have families, and so these immigrants are going to spawn even more population growth in the United States. It is estimated that most Americans can trace their ancestry in this country, their heritage in this country, back to this time period, 1865 to 1920, and this explosion of immigration. I know for a fact that on my father's side, this is how my family came into the United States. This is during this time period is when my father's family came to this country. They were not here prior to this boom generated by industrialization. Now, you can kind of see two different patterns emerging during this period, 1865 to 1920. From like 1865 to 1880, immigrants tended to arrive from the traditional sources of U.S. immigration. Now, before the 1840s, there wasn't a tremendous amount of immigration to the United States. It actually wasn't a part of the American experience in any large number, and it wasn't something that Americans really thought much about. But in the 1840s, we see more immigration. Even before the 1840s, there had been some immigration. Now, the traditional source of immigrants in the United States were largely from like Western Europe. So think about Great Britain, so England, Scotland, Wales, the German lands. So think about the German lands, and even you can throw the Dutch and the Dutch in there. You can throw some France in there as well. Scandinavia, so think your Norway, Sweden, Denmark, to a lesser extent Finland, but for sure Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And then, of course, Ireland. Now, of these immigrants, the vast majority of them were of immigrants from these quote-unquote traditional sources of U.S. immigration. The vast majority of them were able to quote-unquote assimilate or integrate themselves into American life relatively easily. Why? They were understood to be white. They were understood to be mostly Protestant because immigrants from Britain or from Wales, England, Scotland were Protestants from the German lands. You could have Catholics from German lands, but a lot of the immigrants that came to the United States were Protestant. Scandinavia was largely Protestant. So you had, they were understood to be white and they were understood to be Protestant. Of course, as we talked about in a previous lecture, the Irish faced a lot of discrimination because of their Catholicism. And they were the one group that did experience discrimination among the immigrants between 1865 and 1880, when immigration came from traditional sources of U.S. immigration, where we'd had immigrants before. But beginning in 1880 and accelerating in the 1890s, immigration from other parts of Europe and outside of Europe began to occur. And so you start to see immigrants from southern Europe, so Spain, Italy, Greece, but especially Italy and Greece. You began to see immigrants from Eastern Europe. So think the areas that today are Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and the Balkans, so Serbians and Croatians, and Slovenes and people from Russia. And so we got immigrants from other parts of Europe, primarily from Mediterranean or Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe. The majority of these were Christian immigrants, but of course they weren't Protestant. Italians were Catholic, Polish people were Catholic, Hungarians likely were Catholic, the ones who immigrated. People from Spain were Catholic. If they were from Greece, they were from the Orthodox tradition, as they were from Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. So they didn't fit that Protestant idea. They didn't fit that Protestant construct in WASP. And among these were large Jewish populations. And I really want to emphasize that. Among these immigrants were large Jewish populations from Eastern Europe. And of course, they weren't Christian. They spoke primarily Yiddish, which is a language that thrived among Jewish populations and is derived from German, or a form of German. And so there were large Jewish populations among these immigrants from Eastern Europe in particular. Now, these immigrants challenged notions of American identity that revolved around WASP. We will talk, remember WASP is white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. We'll talk about this in more depth later on, but these immigrants challenged notions of WASP because they clearly were not Protestant. They weren't, many of them were Christians, but they weren't Protestant Christians. And many of them were not Christians. They were Jewish. And the question that was raised as these immigrants streamed into the United States, were they white? Because remember how much this political, legal, and racial construct of white carries in the United States. Think about in how many different ways your rights are tied to whiteness. Your political rights, your legal rights, your economic rights, your social standing. And so if you weren't politically, legally, socially understood to be white, then in this country you could face severe discrimination. And immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, be they Christian or Jewish, but particularly Jewish populations, were discriminated against on the basis of whether or not they were considered quote unquote white. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. There were also immigrants from Asia that began to occur, primarily on the West Coast. Immigrants from Europe entered via Ellis Island. By the 1890s and 1900s, they were entering through Ellis Island. Ellis Island was the image that you saw in the background of the introductory slide. But from there, Ellis Island is in the harbor near the Statue of Liberty today, near New York City. So from Ellis Island, they entered New York City, and then from New York City, they could either stay there or they could migrate wherever. And immigrants from Europe did spread throughout the country, particularly in industrial areas. However, immigrants from Asia came through the West Coast, and they tended to stay in the Western United States, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But between the 1850s and 1882, there is Chinese immigration. As I said, in the next lecture, we're going to devote specific lectures to the Chinese immigrant experience. In the 1890s, additional immigrants come from Asia, beginning with Japan, and then in the 1900s, there's immigration from the Philippines, or Filipino immigration. We'll talk more about that later on as well. So those are the raw numbers where immigrants came from. The question is, overall, how were immigrants received? Why did they come? And what were their lives like? Well, as I said, their lives are going to be defined largely by the communities that they live in and the work that they are doing. And we'll talk about that work in lectures down the road in this unit. But what we want to do now is establish the narrative for why immigrants came, and then talk about in some depth, in some detail, we want to talk about sort of like their reception and the factors that influence their reception. So the traditional narrative about immigrants is that they came to the United States seeking freedom from persecution and to find a better life, that the United States was the land of opportunity, the land of freedom, and that's why they came here. They came here, en masse to enjoy the freedoms and liberties and benefits of the United States. There is certainly some truth in that traditional narrative. Certainly, many immigrants did come here facing political, economic hardships from the places they were in Europe, or they were facing persecutions in Europe. This is, in some ways, very true of Jewish populations who were facing persecutions in Eastern Europe and in Russia during the late 19th century. However, I think it's also important to understand that America was not a passive recipient of immigrants, but that immigrants were recruited by Americans. This often gets left off in this story, and I think it's detrimental for us understanding America and detrimental for us understanding how immigrants were received if we don't understand that immigrants were recruited. The American economic growth, the industrial engine that is exploding in the United States that we talked about in the previous lecture, required immigrant labor. Immigrant labor is what drove the American economy. Without these immigrants, you don't get America emerging as an economic juggernaut, one of the largest economies in the world, eventually being the largest economy in the world by the 1920s. You do not get that without immigrants. Immigrants were the labor force that enabled the economy to expand. As a consequence, corporations of all kinds, factories, railroads, mines, etc., they actively sought immigrants. Some of this was informal, simply advertising and getting the story out about opportunities in America or all sorts of work that was available in America. But some of it was out and out recruitment. Businesses went over and went village to village, town to town in these places in Southern and Eastern Europe or in Asia and said, we're looking for workers. We need you to come over. In some cases, they were paying for these workers to come over. In some cases, they were paying for these workers to come over and telling these workers to consider it a loan and they could pay it off through their work. This is a kind of indentured servitude, very similar to what you found in colonial days when indentured servants were recruited to come over to the Americas in exchange for working off the debt of their passage and their housing. This did happen during the industrial era. And so these immigrants were often recruited. That doesn't mean they weren't willing to come over or eager to come over, but they were often recruited. And I think because that gets lost, we tend to have an incorrect narrative about immigrants and immigration in the United States. The problem is when the immigrants got here, they were often employed for exceptionally low wages in difficult, often dangerous working conditions. I alluded at the end of the last lecture to the exceptionally low wages that they were making. We'll talk more about that in a subsequent lecture. But this was, they came here expecting good paying jobs and opportunities that they may or may not have had back in Europe. Although I want to stress that Europe is economically growing as well, especially Western Europe. And so there are good economic opportunities in Europe. So I don't want to make it seem like Europe is a backwater and the United States is this area that is growing. Europe is growing as well economically. So immigrants, were often leaving countries that were developing and modernizing as well in favor of coming here. When they got here, they often faced low wages in very difficult, grueling, potentially dangerous working conditions. But immigrants also faced enormous discrimination. As we've talked about before, American identity was constructed by a dominant WASP culture, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. And this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture was embedded in law. Remember that the 14th Amendment guaranteed birth citizenship, and one of the debates over the 14th Amendment is whether it would apply to immigrants. They wanted to give the former slaves citizenship, but they were also worried about the consequences of giving citizenship to immigrants, say like the Irish immigrants, and that was part of the debate. We also know, right, that whiteness and perceived whiteness was a requirement for naturalization. Remember, the naturalization laws on the books at the time of this massive immigration make whiteness a prerequisite for becoming an American citizen. And so if you weren't legally understood to be white, then if you were an immigrant, if you were born in another land, you had no path to naturalization. And so embedded in this conversation is a whole legal debate about the race of these people coming over, because whiteness brings with it citizenship and political and legal rights. And even irrespective of the citizenship question, we know that in the West, To be labeled Indian was to be labeled non-white, and to be labeled Indian was to be denied political and legal rights, and what is to face tremendous discrimination on the reservations and an extinction of your culture. In addition to the horrors of warfare and violence that Indians experienced, the genocide. We know that in the American South, by the 1890s, Jim Crow is emerging. And in Jim Crow, your whiteness guarantees you rights and privileges not given to non-white people. So whiteness is a legal and political construct. And as immigrants come in, there is a legal debate over their whiteness. And those who are construed to be white, they are going to get political and legal rights and benefits. And those who are not are going to face enormous discrimination. Regardless, there was enormous pressure on all immigrants to assimilate, to basically assimilate into dominant culture, WASP culture, to be like the quote-unquote white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There was enormous pressure to assimilate. And this pressure was in the generation that immigrated, often called the first generation, and in their children and grandchildren, the second and third generations. And in some ways, this assimilation conversation was even more difficult for the second and third generations. Because what you had happen in the late 19th, early 20th century is that the first generation of immigrants wanted to preserve so many of the cultural traditions, religious, linguistic, the religions, the languages, the practices, the customs, the foods, so on and so forth of their native country. They wanted to be able to preserve those things in their new country. Yet there is so many forces forcing them to assimilate, whether it be speaking English or abandoning their religions for Protestant Christianity and Protestant denominations, and to abandon their cultural traditions for what WASP culture, dominant culture, considered to be the way you should behave as a quote-unquote American, right? And the first generation faced those pressures, but also in many ways sought to preserve their old identities. It was the second generation born in the United States and the third generation also born in the United States that found themselves torn between the world within their home and their communities and the world outside. And that pressure and that tearing between two different worlds leads to all sorts of literature and art and just sentiments in which these second and third and fourth generations simply just don't have feelings about identity and belonging that are profound, because they face pressures of what are quote unquote old world pressures at home and new world pressures outside the home. However, even assimilation wasn't enough to stave off prejudice. Even those groups that assimilated often were still prejudiced against, because some immigrants could never assimilate, quote unquote, in ways that satisfied dominant culture. Groups like the Chinese were never going to be legally understood to be white, and therefore no matter what they did, no matter what language they spoke, no matter what religion they practiced, no matter what they did, it would never be enough to satisfy the racist core at the heart of WASP dominant culture. The same was true for Japanese immigrants. The same was true for Jewish immigrants. Now, as you get into other European groups, the prejudice was still there. Catholic immigrants in particular faced tremendous prejudice, but less so than Jewish or immigrant groups from Asia. That's just simply a reality. That's not to say that Italians and Irish and various Catholic groups didn't face discrimination, or Orthodox communities didn't face discrimination. They certainly did, but not to the extent of Jewish immigrants, and Jewish immigrants didn't experience it to the extent that immigrants from Asia did. But what I want you to understand is that discrimination is being driven by dominant WASP social constructs. The same social constructs that have created the political and legal systems that are what define your rights in the United States, be you in the North, the South, or the West, are also defining how immigrants are received. That's such an important point for you to understand. Now, in spite of prejudice and discrimination, immigrants profoundly transformed American life. America became the most diverse country in the world because immigrants brought their culture, languages, traditions, and religions in spite of the prejudice. There was simply nothing like America, even in places like Great Britain, which were very multicultural compared to the rest of Europe. But America was simply on a different level. There were more languages spoken here, more religions practiced here, more diverse cultural traditions practiced here than any other place in the world. Now, where you would see this transformation most profoundly were in American cities, because immigrants largely settled in cities. That is a reflection of the fact that they were coming to work in the industrial economy, and you mostly found the industrial economy in cities. Now, they did go to rural areas, particularly rural areas where there were mines. So if you go to any part of rural America, be it rural Kentucky, rural Pennsylvania, rural Washington, you can go to the cemeteries in mining towns and you can see just how diverse it was, reflecting the diversity of immigrants coming to work in an industrial economy, in this case mining. But for the most part, the transformation of this world is going to be found in cities. Because as I said, American cities grew by 700% during 1865 to 1920. Cities just grew by the millions during this time period. And in those cities, immigrants left their mark. And I just wanted to give you some statistics to back that up. In 1890, the city of Chicago, 80% of the people who live in the city of Chicago are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. 87% of the city of Chicago, a city that has well over 1 million people by 1890, is either 87% of that population are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. New York City in 1890, 80%. 80% of that city was either immigrants or the children of immigrants in 1890. Milwaukee and Detroit were 84%. Immigrants were transforming American cities. Now, the mark they leave upon these cities reflects both the diversity of their heritage and the prejudices that they faced. What you find in these cities are ethnic neighborhoods, right? And what we mean by ethnic neighborhoods is you see things like, Irish neighborhoods, Little Italy, Jewish neighborhoods, Croatian neighborhoods, Russian neighborhoods, all so on and so forth. That immigrants tended to congregate in parts of cities that were what geographers often call ethnic enclaves. Now, the reason for that is twofold. In some cases, it's about comfort and protection. You want to go and live, when you immigrate, you want to go and live next to people who speak your language, practice your cultural traditions, but also, it's a refuge, it's a protection from the discrimination of dominant WASP culture, who are consistently discriminating against you and pressuring you to assimilate. But some of this is a reflection of deeper discrimination. So what you often find in the late 19th, early 20th century is the emergence of these things called covenants. Covenants, C-O-V-E-N-A-N-T-S. What covenants were clauses placed in property deeds that forbid pieces of property to either be sold to or rented to certain groups. Now, this was mostly used against people who were understood to be non-white. So covenants were mostly used against black people or Asian immigrants or people of Asian heritage or against Native American people. But it could also be used against certain groups like Catholics or Jews. You could have covenants that forbid them from renting or businesses or homes or apartments, or buying homes, properties, and businesses in certain neighborhoods, and therefore segregation was created out of these covenants. Now, as I said, we'll talk more about covenants later in this class, but their use starts to emerge at this time period. Now, like I said, the covenants were largely used against people who were legally understood to be non-white: African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and sometimes Jewish groups. Nonetheless, the covenants could be used against other groups for discrimination. So a consequence of prejudice and discrimination and comfort and covenants often created these sort of ethnic neighborhoods. Now, I want to make clear here that immigration discussions in the U.S. at this time are not just framed by WASP identity, but also social Darwinism and eugenics ideas. Social Darwinism, remember, is this process by which Darwinian biology and evolutionary ideas are being used to discriminate against people on the basis of socially constructed racial categories, and white people who are understood to be people of Europe, of Northern and Western European descent, are considered the superior group, and everyone else is lesser. Social Darwinism is a pseudoscience used to justify white supremacy. And then out of social Darwinism comes eugenics. This idea is, if our pseudoscience is established that that white people, and white people being defined again as people from Western and Northern Europe, are the dominant group, then we should have laws and policies that engineer a society based on those ideas of who should be dominant. And so eugenics was a further pseudoscience derived from social Darwinism, meant to construct a racially pure society. And these ideas are in circulation. We've talked about them before. They're at the core of how African Americans are understood, and at the core of how Native Americans are understood and treated. Well, these ideas are applied to immigrants as well. They're applied to immigrants from Asia. They're applied to immigrants from Europe. And so these ideas are impacting how immigrants are received. And ultimately, a combination of WASP identity, social Darwinism, eugenics, and a discomfort with immigrants results by the 1880s in what we call nativism or nativist movements. You're absolutely going to have to know what nativists are for this class, because it's really important for the next coming units. Nativists are groups that argue that the United States should be for Native Americans. And they don't mean indigenous peoples. They don't mean American Indians. They mean Americans who were born here. They mean WASP identity, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Now you might be thinking, well, isn't there kind of a horrible hypocrisy at the core of nativism, and that no one of European ancestry is ultimately derived from North America? They're derived from Europe, and that this land, the only true people born in this land are indigenous peoples. And you're absolutely right about that. But the nativist thinkers, inspired by notions of WASP, social Darwinism, and eugenics, didn't see the hypocrisy at the core of their ideas. They just believed that they were anti-immigrant, that their ideas about America revolved around people who were born here, that they understood to be of Northern and Western European ancestry, largely WASP, and they were anti-immigrant. They wanted the immigrants gone. They thought the immigrants were destroying America. They thought the immigrants were, soiling America, that America was no longer clean and pure, that it was becoming immoral and amoral because of these immigrants. These immigrants were bringing their culture and their traditions that were antithetical to America here. And they were groups that were openly prejudicial. They argued that America was being destroyed by immigrants because immigrants weren't fit to be here. They were using ideas of WASP and social Darwinism and eugenics to argue against immigrants. They are inherently prejudicial, racist groups. but they were groups whose ideas were taken quite seriously, particularly among American elite families, as we'll talk about later. And nativism becomes an important thread and strain in American politics and life from the 1880s on, corresponding with the arrival of immigrants from areas like Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and especially Asia. And so what happens is many groups begin to organize to argue against immigrants. They are anti-immigrant groups. We're going to talk about two as we conclude this lecture. The first was formed in 1887. It's called the American Protective Society. The American Protective Society, also known as the American Protective Association, right? It's known as both. This group was crude and vile, and if you read their documents, they are saying racist, hateful, anti-Semitic, prejudicial things. They're a xenophobic group. They hate any group that they have deemed as foreigners. They particularly hated Catholics. And by 1894, they have 500,000 members. And they're producing the most vile and hateful pamphlets that they're sending all over the United States. In 1894, another group was created called the Immigration Restrictive League. And this was founded by a bunch of wealthy elite people who were Harvard alumni who graduated from America's most prestigious university. The goal of these groups is to force Congress to either restrict or permanently end immigration. They are arguing for a particular view of America, and that view of America does not include people they don't deem to be either American or white or both. And they are openly talking about ending immigration, and they are saying hateful, prejudicial, discriminatory things about immigrants. And they're becoming an important part of American political dialogue despite their hate, despite their vitriol. All right, that's your overview of the immigrant experience in America. In the next lecture, we're going to dig deeper into the Chinese immigrant experience. I thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.